Well, good morning, everyone. Really sorry you had to wait. We were a little bit late. Passionate about the discussion this morning. It's a great pleasure to, as the Dean of the school, to welcome you for this third edition of the Climate Days. And, you know, we're very excited and we like this idea of bringing academics, government representatives, startups, corporates, students in the same place to discuss about important issues. Climate Days are part of a trilogy of days we have at HEC. We have the Purpose Days, we have the Inclusive Days, and Climate Days. And it's all part of the whole mission of the SNO, Sustainability and Organization Center, that was launched many years ago. And it's really around this idea of think, teach, and act. And we all believe that acting is a very important part of what we need to do also in different schools. Navigating the path to net zero. What an important mission that we have. We all know it's very, very important. Fundamental. It's not about incremental change. It's about transformation, and it's also very important in the perspective of the COP29 to come in Baku, and we know the topic of finance and loss and damages fund is really at the heart of the next COP29. So talking about finance in a business school is also something which is of great importance. In that perspective, we are very happy to have a keynote speaker, Mr. Cheikh DIONG today, and Fernando will present him in a minute, and talking a little bit more about Africa. We were talking this morning that at HEC we have 135 different nationalities on campus. It's really a concert of nations that we have here on campus, and we believe that the voice of Africa has to be stronger than what it is generally. So we're very happy and honored to have you here this morning to share a little bit of your experience and talk about some of the challenges ahead. So again, thank you very much. Some of you come from far away, some eventually very close, but we are very delighted to have you on campus for this day. And Fernando, I'll leave you the floor for a more in-depth presentation of our keynote speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our Dean, Eloic. Welcome, everybody. It was an early morning for most of you. Coming to campus is not always straightforward, so we really appreciate you being here. And what a day we have today, not only because we are here together and because we care about this topic, but because for the first time in the history of the Climate Days, we have an international and very well-renowned speaker with us, Mr. Ibrahima Cheikh DIONG. He is nonetheless, he is the Assistant General of United Nations, and he's a thought leader in climate resilience and climate financing, and he's been working for more than 30 years worldwide, except in Latin America, I hear. But he has an amazing view, and he brings the African voice to the topic of climate finance to navigate the net zero. He is the Director General of the African Risk Capacity Agency and the African Risk Capacity Group, which is a specialized agency of the African Union, and that it is the entity mandated to provide climate risk insurance and climate risk management assistance to African countries, and is an actor in the discussions towards Baku. Without further ado, we are very honored to welcome Mr. DIONG today, who will be speaking, and after that we have a we have a moment to exchange with the rest of the audience. And keep in mind that this is the first time also that we are streaming live towards different parts of the world, especially towards Africa. So our online audience is also welcome to tune in and send their questions and comments for Mr. Ibrahima. The floor is yours. A pleasure to have you here. A round of applause.
Well, thank you very much to Eloic and Fernando for that warm introductions. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Bonjour. Well, and also good morning to those who are watching us online, because I understand this is watched from around the world. And that is a sign of the commitment to Climate Day, but also to the work that HEC is doing here in Paris. Now, one thing about university that I enjoy, it makes you feel 30 years younger, because of the energy and the vibe that I feel anytime I speak at any universities around the world. And being here certainly brings back memories of many years ago. I'm not going to reveal my age, but it really shows the connection of the real world that I belong to, but also the world of university. I was telling Eliot earlier that I love the motto of the university, and that is to think, teach, and act. So my presence here is certainly the act part of the university by connecting the academic world to the practitioners that we are. So at least we can revisit some of the stuff you do at university, but also what we do actually in the world that I belong to. Now, climate change, I always wonder, the question that I ask myself all the time, why does it matter? Before I get into the topic, is it because we have to care about our well-being of today and making sure we at least protect our world? Is it because we have a moral obligation to generation to come, so that 30, 50 years down the road, we can tell our kids and grandkids what we've done with this world? Is it because we have to actually protect the species in the world that we're in? Or just because it affects our economy in the way that we have a responsibility to do something about it? Now, I wanted to hold your thoughts and the answers to the question. Maybe by the time I finish my talk, you may want to share with me your response to those questions. So it is important to have this conversation in terms of the timing for three reasons. Number one, as Fernando said, we're about to get to COP29, where climate finance is going to be the focus. It is really important that 6 months from now, we're having this conversation in terms of what needs to be done to make sure in Baku, at COP29, climate finance is not just a mere talk, it's something at least to get to the bottom of where would we be putting all the billions that we're mobilizing climate finance. This conversation is timely because at COP28 in Dubai, the world made a commitment to put together a fund called the Loss and Damage, and that is mostly deal with the impact of climate change, particularly in the developing world. The good news, that fund is about to be operational, so a lot has happened since then. And this talk is timely because this is here in Paris, about in 2015, then the main agreement on climate change was made here by global leaders, whereby people actually recognize the importance of climate change, and that's why coming back to Paris, having this talk, I could not think of a better city to have this conversation. What I want to do in my talk is like three things: life before Paris, life after Paris, but also what does that mean for Africa in terms of managing risk when it comes to climate risk and climate shock. And obviously, I will leave some food for thought so that we can have a conversation after my presentation. Now, my view of life before Paris was that it was extremely difficult to figure out what we're trying to do with climate change. Number one, the science, and I'm glad we got some people who actually believe in science and numbers, was such you got two schools of thoughts: those who believe in climate change and those who don't. And I think the conversation was actually stuck at that level in terms of the numbers. And eventually, you can't, depending on where you sit, you have a different perspective in terms of what climate change means. Second, to make the numbers more complicated, the politicians get involved. Depending on whether you're running for election, or you're running for re-election, your relationship to climate change was quite different. to the extent that it was very difficult to get actually a political commitment from the leaders when it came to climate change. Third, it was very difficult to at least get people to actually, we would say, polluters pay, actually to recognize those who contribute to global warming have a moral responsibility in providing the resources so we can deal with the negative effect of climate change. Last but not least, the framework for negotiation was such, it was very difficult to get the parties around the table to have a conversation about climate change. So I think it was a very difficult world to get to any actually consensus in what to do with climate change. While that was happening, the extreme weather condition was getting worse. The impact was actually tremendous, particularly in developing countries. And that's what we got before Paris. So Paris came in for the first time. In my view, in Paris, it was actually recognized there is a global crisis in the climate change, and the only way it can be addressed by global solidarity. And that is why Paris is actually considered as a landmark, as an event basically for the first time we actually recognizing that something needs to be done. It was in Paris also that it was decided that we need to actually bring down the global temperature to less than 2%, and in some cases actually people even suggested 1.5 if we want to actually reduce the impact of climate change. And that is also a mega decision in Paris as well. It was also in Paris that the global climate communities agreed that it's extremely critical that we have a system in place to actually monitor what the countries are doing to actually contribute in lowering the temperature. And that came to the famous, what they call NDCs, the nationally determined contribution, whereby each of the countries basically have to contribute in making sure we actually lower the global temperature. It was also in Paris that it was decided that the global international community will have to provide about $100 billion annually for the next 10 years in dealing with the adaptation of climate change. It was also in Paris, in my view, for the first time, we set up the framework of negotiations on climate for years to come, which is now created to what we call the COP27, COP28, and so on. So the question is, after Paris, what did we achieve? Now, obviously, we are not far from getting to less than 2% or even 1.5%. In fact, if you look at the recent IPCC report, it's clear we're far from achieving that goals. So we need to do more in decarbonizing the global economy so we can reach the 2% that we promised ourselves. What do we do also on the nationally determined contribution? We are far from providing the capacities to developing countries, Africa in particular, and making sure at least the contribution from countries is such we can actually contribute to lowering the temperature. We also made a promise in Paris in providing $100 billion annually in dealing with adaptation. We were far from the promise in terms of the commitment, even though the Green Climate Fund was set up after Paris and is providing funding for adaptation in many countries. It was also in Paris, as I said, we achieved at least for the first time a framework that provided at least opportunity for countries to sit around the table, not putting the blame game, but also negotiating in the way that we can actually take into account the interests and the concerns of all the countries. Nevertheless, there is some consensus, at least after Paris. Number one, I think for the first time in my view, the global economy, the global community, recognizing there's a crisis, and that crisis needs to be dealt as a community and not separately. Also, it was in Paris in terms of the consensus. If you look at COP27, COP28 in Dubai and in Sharm el-Sheikh, for the first time, we're recognizing that loss and damage is extremely critical and important. And that is to recognize that those who contribute less to climate change should not actually suffer from the impact of climate change. And that is why the fact that we have a loss and damage, in my view, is a major, major, major milestone in dealing with the effect of climate change. Now, obviously, the jury is still out and see whether that fund will be operational as soon as possible. What's important in the fund are twofold. Number one, what we call direct access. In other words, would the fund be available whereby resources can be actually targeted and channeled to where the need is across the developing world? If you have to go through cumbersome procedures to get funding available to where it's needed, obviously we can't save livelihoods. It's very important that when the fund is operational, it goes to where it's needed. And the needs, as far as Africa is concerned, is making sure we mainstream early warning systems across Africa, but also the ability to provide additional resources for government to actually respond to climate disasters where necessary. It is also important that there's a consensus today that adaptation matters, at least for the developing countries. While mitigation is important, but when it comes to adaptation, it is important that the countries that are dealing with the effect of climate change are such that they can adapt where necessary, so it can obviously be able to protect the life and livelihood of many countries and developing countries in particular. So the big question, going back to our topic today, what does that mean for developing countries when it comes to managing risk, when it comes to saving the lives of many people who are affected by climate change? Threefold. Number one, if you look at in the case of Africa, what is the problem that we're faced with? We're seeing extreme weather conditions actually becoming extreme. For those who are following the drought situation in Southern Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique are all faced with extreme weather conditions, particularly with regard to drought, affecting millions of people in those countries. We've seen also the tropical cyclone happening in Madagascar and Mozambique, and then flood in many countries in Africa. So all these disasters have two impacts on the continent. First of all, economic losses. Most of these countries are obviously challenged whenever they have to deal with a disaster related to climate, to the extent it's a setback to most of these countries, and to the extent that actually countries have to juggle and balance between development ambitions, but also climate obligation. But it also has something which is really something of interest to us as Africans, what I call the human face of climate change. And those are the people who are affected by food insecurity. These are the people who are affected by the basic infrastructure being destroyed. These are the people actually whose livelihood are affected, in some cases even life being lost. So the question is, how do you deal with that risk in a way that you can protect life? There are two options: business as usual, and that is you wait till it happened. By the time the resources are available, it may be too late. And we can't afford to do that. And that's why it's really important to think innovatively what else we could do. Three things, and that's really the whole bottom line of disaster risk management financing. Number one, you can't fix the problem unless you understand the magnitude of the problem. And that is why the whole concept of risk profiling, early warning system are extremely critical in addressing climate risk on the continent. I spoke to the Dean, but also to Fernando earlier, that one of the ambitions of the Secretary General of the United Nations is actually mainstreaming early warning system across developing countries so we can actually make informed decisions on climate. Now that early warning system has two components. Number one, early warning system made available to policymakers can make informed decisions saving lives. I was giving them an example earlier in Madagascar. The fact that we made early warning system for tropical cyclone available to the government, they were able actually to move 5,000 people from harm's way before the storm actually strike. And we talk about 5,000 people's lives actually being saved. And that is why availing early warning system and data to policymakers allows them basically to make informed decisions that can save lives. But early warning system also help government to anticipate on what to do with the risk that you're exposed to. In this particular case, that understanding of the risk allows government to do two things: to return the risk within your own budget, so you can anticipate, but also to take the risk and take it to the insurance market so you can mobilize additional resources. So the second thing that's equally important, and I was telling the team earlier, and that is that most government in Africa, when there is a disaster, they tend to be extremely overwhelmed. And the reason is very simple, because there's so many other priorities the government have to deal with, whereby when you have a particular risk related to climate, you have to make a choice of whether to deal with your education system or infrastructure, or dealing with the impact of climate change on the people that you have to protect. So therefore, it is extremely important to build the culture within government of contingency planning, whereby government can actually anticipate in dealing with the impact of climate risk by planning better. The last part is equally important, is the response. How do you respond basically to a climate risk? And this is where the innovation comes in. So most of these countries, when they deal with this risk, if they take that risk on their own to the insurance market, the premium may be extremely expensive for them to be able to afford that premium that they have to pay in order to anticipate. So the innovation comes by pulling the risk, by saying to countries X, Y, and Z, don't go to the insurance market alone. Let's go together as a pool, and that pool allows you to get better terms in terms of premium. But more importantly, it's important to actually recognize that that drought does not happen at the same time in all the countries. So therefore, when you get a payout, it allows you basically to finance your first response as a country. Now that innovation is picking up so nicely in Africa to the extent that now people think about scaling it up. What I just defined and described to you, it's not just a concept, it's a reality when it comes to the organization that I run. It's called the African Risk Capacity. It was created 30 years ago by the African Union to make sure what we do, African solution to African problems. And that is by, number one, showing leadership, creating an institution entirely dedicated in providing the kind of support that I just described. Since our inception, we provided up to $1 billion worth of coverage, protected 100 million people, made a payout of 150 million people to African countries, all disasters combined. And that is the kind of innovation you need on the continent to making sure you deal with climate risk. But let me be absolutely clear, insurance is not the only answer. There may be cases whereby the risk hasn't triggered, and you can pay through insurance, and you cannot be too technical when people actually are dying or affected by climate change. And that is why the response to climate risk on the continent requires to come up with a diversity of financial instruments which you can actually deploy wherever you have to deal with the climate shock. And Africa is on the forefront in making sure that we can basically be part of the solution as opposed to be part of the problem. So where do we stand today in scaling up such a method that I just described? There are a couple of ways of scaling up. Number one, disaster does not mean the same thing to all of our countries. In some countries that are faced with drought, some is tropical cyclone, some is flood, some is outbreak and epidemic. So the ability to provide a diversified pool of product to countries is a way of responding to the demand of the countries as opposed to just providing a particular product in terms of a drought. And I was discussing with the university earlier, that kind of product, the challenge that we're faced with is the reliability of data, data management, risk profiling, and risk pooling, to the extent that I'm looking forward to working with the university so we can actually improve our data management in a way that the product we put in the market are as reliable as possible. The second challenge of what I just described to you is what I call the AAA of premium financing. The availability, the accessibility, and the affordability of premium. Countries may actually believe that going to the insurance market is a way of mobilizing resources, but in some cases they may not be able to actually afford to pay the premium. It is our responsibility, because global climate crisis calls for global solidarity, to support a country who can't afford to pay the premium so they can at least have access to the opportunity provided by the insurance. That type of model also requires, beyond this insurance, capacity building and technical assistance to countries so they can do it themselves. We are not in the position of doing this for Africa forever. We want to be able to get to the point where the countries can do it themselves so that disaster risk management is actually embedded in public policy, because the responsibility of the government is to anticipate, because governing is anticipating. It's not waiting until it happens. So it's really important that countries begin to do it themselves. Let me just, I hope by now you get a sense of why those questions are important in terms of why climate change matters. Because it's our responsibility for generations to come and make sure we at least leave our future generation with a healthier world that we came in. It is our responsibility in making sure all the species are protected, because we are a species as human beings, and making sure that our actions do not actually impact the way we see the world. It is our responsibility in making sure food security becomes something constant, particularly in Africa, where many vulnerable people are affected by the fact that climate change is actually impacting them. I think the food for thought is that hopefully commitment matter. Many countries came to Paris, made commitment to provide billions of dollars to adapt. I hope as we get to COP29 in Baku, those commitments will be honored to the extent that at least the additional $1 billion needed to adapt are actually provided. Early warning systems do save life, and as the Secretary General of the United Nations said time and time again, it needs to be mainstream in the way that across the developing world, we have access to technology, risk modeling, and data, so we can make informed decisions about dealing with the effect of climate change. And what I want to leave you with is the following. Everything that we do is important as long as we don't lose the sight of the human face of climate change, and that is the millions of people around the world who are affected by climate change and their life matter. Thank you very much.
Would you like to sit or would you like to keep standing?
We can stand.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We arrived the moment we need a, thank you. This is the moment where we, and Mr. Ibrahima was very, very kind since the beginning to say, well, I'm in Paris to have a discussion also with the students, with the relationships, with the visitors, with the faculty. And this is a moment where we, my colleagues at the Climate Center will have microphones. If you have a question, I'm more than happy to moderate this discussion. And I need a second microphone. For Mr. Ibrahima Cheikh DIONG, what a powerful message, and not only the African voice, but also the global landscape before and after Paris. We are very, very fortunate to be in Paris, but at the same time, well, the reality of climate and the human face of climate is not always so visible for us. So, meanwhile, our audience, our friends and our guests think about your questions, because we have enough time for interactive discussion. That has always been the plan. The first, maybe, you know, Baku is coming around the corner, and if you would think of an ideal outcome in terms of a quantifiable outcome for climate financing, because that's the key in the discussions. What would you say about that? What is in your wish list?
Well, I think there are two things. Number one, as I said earlier, before you make some new commitment, you have to actually order the commitment that you already made in Paris and beyond. If some of you were in COP28 in Dubai, countries made a commitment of about $661 million to actually add to the loss and damage fund. Obviously, the demand is huge and even bigger than actually $661 million. So my expectation from COP29 is to make sure we get more commitment in the belly, because the impact of climate change on the continent or in developing countries in general is far bigger than that. So I think number one is just to get that commitment made so we can get more resources when it comes to loss and damage. I think my second expectation is that it's not just about loss and damage. The energy transitions, the green economy, whereby additional resources are also needed. So I think we need to get to the point whereby resources are provided by the developing world, or the developing world, I should say, sorry, so that we can address different aspects of climate change. I was fortunate enough, about a few months ago, I was in Riyadh, and the COP29 presidency, actually Azerbaijan, had a closed-door session, which I was invited to, and I used that opportunity to make the case about Africa, but also our expectations. My understanding is not only it will be providing additional resources, but what's important is the accessibility to those resources. There is no point of having resources you can't access. So we have to look at the funding, but also the procedures whereby when funding actually committed to, the system is such that the procedure are not cumbersome to access. And I keep saying about what I call the AAA of climate finance: accessibility to these funds, availability to these funds, but also affordability, whereby the countries that need the funding obviously will access this funding as soon as possible so we can actually protect lives. So high expectation, more resources, but better and less cumbersome actually procedures so accessibility will be faster and accessible to those who need them.
Thank you, Mr. Ibrahima. Questions also from an online public. You can also raise questions. Please type your questions, and one of our colleagues will be taking up your questions. We have a couple questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you. My question will be about, you said that adaptability is so important for the continent, but sometimes when we talk about the African continent, we are thinking about the capacity to leapfrog our economies towards a more sustainable economy. But I would like to know, is it effective in the African continent? Companies, government, do they really want to leapfrog our economies toward a more sustainable? Because I think that today, for a continent which is really which really have difficulties to develop, it is really easy to use, for example, oil, fossil fuels to develop industries and etc. But when it's come to transition to clean energy, don't you think that it's going to be difficult for us? And how government what are they doing currently to resolve that?
Well, I mean, I think my answer to that question is the following. If you look at today the numbers, Africa contributes less than 4% to greenhouse gases. So we're not the main polluters when it comes to climate change. That's the reason why Africa is saying pretty much, even though we contribute less than 4%, but we're actually suffering from the impact of climate change, what I talked about earlier, drought and tropical cyclone and so on, and the most vulnerable being affected. So I think number one, we need to do exactly what I said about loss and damage, and making sure at least those who contribute less do not actually suffer because of climate change, so we can protect life. I think second, you brought up a very good point, that how do you find a balance between your development ambition and also the climate obligation, which you have to oblige you because you belong to the global economy. And I believe what Africans are saying do not prevent us from actually using our resources to actually develop our economies. But at the same time, Africa is also sensitive to the fact that we don't want to make the same mistake that have made with our natural resources. I think there is a middle ground to strike in making sure that clean economy, the green economy, becomes really an opportunity for us to develop some renewables and other type of energy so we don't actually make the same mistakes. So therefore, what the Africans are saying, and they said it loud and clear, when they had the African Climate Summit with heads of state in Nairobi last year, is number one, we are pushing the international community to actually decarbonize the global economy, so we at least reduce the greenhouse gases. Number two, we're talking about the funding and the commitment made to help Africans to deal with the impact of climate change should be honored. So that way, those resources will help us to deal with the impact. But at the same time, climate change also provides opportunities when it comes to, for example, green economy and green jobs. These are areas that requires funding, capacities, in some cases at least support African countries. And I think across Africa, they begin to recognize it's not just a problem, it's also an opportunity we need to actually seize and make sure we can fulfill our development obligation, but at the same time seizing the opportunity provided by the green economy to create some new jobs, but also maybe get some of the entrepreneurs. And I leaked the deal was talking about earlier about the entrepreneurship plan in the university. I guess in the next type of entrepreneurs should also look at the green economy as an opportunity to be part of the solutions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have another question there. And we are monitoring also our guests on YouTube and Facebook Live to see if there are additional questions. Please.
Thank you so much for this amazing speech. My question is in terms of allocation of the money of the Loss and Damage Fund. So my question is, how can we make sure that the money in the Loss and Damage Fund really comes to the areas in Africa where it's really the most needed? Yes.
Yeah, there are two major issues of Loss and Damage Fund. One is called direct access. The other one is actually using existing organization on the continent to make sure money goes to where it's needed. On the direct access, what the Africans are saying in general, and making sure that when the resources are available, through a direct access, you can actually get money to where it's needed very quickly. Because in the business of loss and damage, if money doesn't get to where it's needed as quick as possible, you're not saving lives. Because loss and damage is all about reducing the loss and the damage on the people affected. So I think many Africans who are involved in the business of loss and damage are pushing for the fund to be nimble, flexible, and mean and lean, to the extent when the funding are available, that direct access allows the fund to get the funding where it's needed. And so hopefully that will be the approach of loss and damage. And then second, loss and damage as the fund make actually funding available to countries where it's needed. What's important, there are existing organizations that have been doing this for years, mine included. The African Risk Capacity has been doing loss and damage for quite a number of years. So I think funds like that, their objective is not to weaken them, is to empower them to the extent that we can actually speed up implementation by making actually funding available to those who are doing what we're doing for the past 13 years to help us to scale up. I think if we manage to do those two, in my view, we'll get the funding where it's needed so we can match supply and demand across Africa.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. DIONG. A question related to that, if I may. Meanwhile, we have a couple additional questions. Closing the gap between supply and demand and making it accessible, actionable, relevant, and timely. Those are keywords that you've been mentioning earlier, but I'm sure this was also some of the key points in the discussions at the roundtable in Johannesburg a few weeks ago about the closing the gap in mobilizing climate finance. But can you tell us some lessons that you have learned at the African Risk Capacity Group on how to actually make this happening, closing the gap in access to finance, but also putting it where it's needed in timely and in a very actionable way?
Right, and as I said earlier, if you look at all the COP and COP28 in Dubai included, the conversation has always been about the supply side. In other words, how much money do we need to adapt to climate change across the developing world? And that conversation is very useful because we need to get as many billions as possible to address the concern. But the question is, when the money is available, where should we actually direct the resources to, particularly in the developing world? In my view, there are three areas where funding should actually go into. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, early warning system is extremely important. And that is today the level of sophistication we have in climate science in terms of risk profiling, modeling, is such that those instruments should be made available to developing countries as a whole, Africa included. So at least we can help countries to actually understand the magnitude of the problem that they face with. And that could be mainstream across developing countries so that policymakers can actually make decisions based on data, but not just based on generalities. So I will definitely put a lot of money into mainstreaming early warning system across the developing world. I think second, as I said earlier, capacity building and contingency planning and preparing countries is extremely important to make sure that countries actually have what it takes to deliver. The reality is most of the countries in Africa included, they get extremely overwhelmed when they deal with a tropical cyclone, flood, and drought across the board. Lack of preparation makes all these countries actually not only overwhelmed, but caught by surprise. And in the business of climate change disasters, every second count. If you actually don't get prepared as the countries, the reality is you're going to find yourself basically overwhelmed with drought, tropical cyclone, and flood, and that is not acceptable. I think the last thing where I put money into what I call the financial instrument that can deal with different types of climate shocks. Again, as I said, insurance is not the only answer. Countries are interested in having social safety net, solidarity fund, contingency funding. All these different instruments allows government, in the case of disasters, to react, but react rapidly so you can save lives. And last but not least, where I will definitely put some money into fostering the green economy, helping countries to adapt more, energy transition, clean actually cooking, all these things that are important to make sure that the European countries can actually learn from the mistakes of others and be able to at least turn the climate crisis as something that we can deal with in terms of the impact, but at the same time an opportunity to grow our economy in a much more healthy way.
We have Another question from the audience. I think I saw a hand somewhere over there. Thank you, Mr. DIONG. Yes, we have an additional question. It'd be great if you're a guest visiting today, please state your name and then your question, because we also know where you're coming from.
And make sure your question is easy so I can give you the answer.
I'll try my best. Good morning. My name is Brida. I'm an MBA student. In relation to early warning systems, I was wondering how or what measures can we take to ensure that early warning systems actually translate into preventive action by governments for the communities. So I'm part Nigerian, and we do have a situation where the River Niger frequently, as it is now, overflows its banks. And we've had situations where it's been really intense and people have died. Now, I think it was about a year or two ago where there were actually rumors that, okay, around this month we're going to have a flood, and the government did nothing about it. So to me, it seems there was some sort of early warning system but no action was actually taken. So how do we go about ensuring that even when early warning systems are in place, the government actually moves to take action? Thank you.
Thank you. Part Nigerian, part?
Irish.
Irish, okay. All right, I'm part Senegalese and part Senegalese. Well, look, I think you brought up a very good question. This is something we struggle with in our line of work every single day. One thing is to have early warning system, but if they're not utilized by policymakers to make decisions, it's not going to help the continent. And that's the reason why, I mentioned earlier, in the case of Madagascar, when we made early warning system for tropical cyclone available to government, 5 days before the tropical cyclone, the fact that they used information allowed them to evacuate about 5,000 people from harm's way. And that's the way you want early warning system to be utilized in actually saving lives. There may be cases, I can give you tons of examples, for example, in South Africa, when they faced the drought in Durban, a lot of NGOs did say if the government has acted and acted on the early warning system, maybe they would not lose as much life as they did, for example, in South Africa. So therefore, I think the challenge, to get reliable early warning system data, but convincing policymakers to use them at the right time so you can at least save lives. In fact, a couple of initiatives on the continent, which in my view are laudable. At the African Union, they have something called a flood situation room. And that is basically a platform where they gather all the information related to flood on the continent with data and modeling, and they can anticipate a particular flood coming in, whereby they can actually assemble policymakers around the table and say, this is what's coming up, and this is certainly something that if you don't do anything about it, obviously it could lead to damages in terms of lives in Nigeria or other parts of Africa. So I think the first step of making sure we can get reliable data management coming to disasters. Second, obviously there's a lot of things to be done in convincing policymakers to utilize them. In my view, the best way to do that is what we call evidence-based advocacy. Use example like we've done in Madagascar, in other parts of Africa, where by using early warning system, we can demonstrate the ability from a country to protect their citizen. So with the hope that when they see the benefit of that early warning system saving lives, countries will begin to use that as a way of making policy decisions. It's not just about climate change. In every single part of policy making, it has to be data-driven and data-informed, so the decision you make at least can be at least adequate decisions. So I'm hoping with the discussion we're having with the university here, in improving our data management and risk modeling, we can begin to make reliable data as well as risk modeling available to countries so they can make informed decisions. Now, obviously, policymakers are what they are. In some cases, politicians don't always act on information, but I think eventually it's our responsibility collectively and make sure that the research and the data that we collect don't sit on the shelf, but are utilized to make policy decisions, because ultimately, as I say, early warning systems do save lives. It's not just about numbers, it's about people.
Good morning, Mr. DIONG. Daniel
And
Brown.
an easy question or reflect? No.
A couple of challenging ones, perhaps, that have come in online. So the first one is from Sushil in Delhi, who sends in a question. He's asking if it's possible to be more specific on the needs that sorry, let me put on my glasses. I can't. You said that you feel you needed more commitments from the COP in Baku. And he was wondering if there's a way of comparing the needs that you're hoping Baku will provide with the last commitments of the previous COPs.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, let's just take the case of loss and damage. For 20-something years, it was always a very difficult topic at COP negotiation because the concept of polluters pay was something that's basically not kind of, that's what I'm looking for. It was not something basically very popular, particularly for those who actually contribute to greenhouse gases. So the idea of saying because we contribute to climate change, we need to actually pay was not something widely accepted. And the developing countries were actually pushing. We need to get a fund dedicated to making sure we can protect those who are affected by climate change. And finally, at COP27, at COP28, that concept was accepted, and for the first time, we have what we call a loss and damage fund. So I think from a governance perspective, it is good that we have a fund dedicated to this. Second, there was a commitment made at COP28 that we want that fund to be operational as soon as possible. But the fact that there is a board now up and running, they're about to select an executive director and a secretariat, and I understand the intention by the time we get to COP29 to basically make sure that the fund is fully operational. I mentioned earlier, $661 million is far below what the needs are. So the expectation is that by the time we get to COP29, we can get more pledges, more commitment going to the fund, so you can get the structure, the governance, but also the funding. But also more importantly, as I mentioned earlier, direct access to money going to active ways needed is extremely important. So that is certainly, in my view, a major milestone when we get to COP29 in demonstrating we're serious about dealing with the effect of climate change. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, in Paris, $100 billion annually for 10 years were committed. That is not the case today, but you can bet that the developed country will begin to actually push to make sure at least we can get additional resources. But my point has always been, let's not wait till the funding is available to think about where do we direct the money to in the developing world. And that's why spending a lot of time on the demand, on the needs, to make sure when funding is available, the direct where it's needed is as important as the supply conversation, because ultimately, make sure we can go fast and when it goes to where it's needed.
Let's turn to the mother continent. There's a question sent in from Ibrahim in Nigeria, and he says it's a long.
That's not my brother, isn't it?
It's a long comment and a question, I assure you. He says your model that you described earlier really underlines that it's a call for Africans to resolve African problems. Now, we know that this is the way to go, he says, after the disasters seen in the past policies by Bretton Woods institutions. So how do you overcome the social and cultural specificities of each country or region? And he gives the example, of course, of the 300+ ethno-linguistic communities in Nigeria, for example. So he's suggesting perhaps that social anthropologists could be useful to assist in this drive.
That is not a question I give to my brother. It's quite complicated. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things I will say to that. I mean, I mentioned earlier, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Disaster does not mean the same thing to all of our countries. So I think recognizing the diversity of the problem, in my view, is a good starting point, and making sure we don't come up with this one-size-fits-all kind of solutions. And that is why at the African Risk Capacity Group, which I have the honor of leading, we're looking at disaster in a way that we take into account the demand of the different countries, as opposed to looking at, it's the same thing about drought in Nigeria, in Senegal, in other parts of Africa. I think second, it is also extremely important that we actually do what we call a demand-driven solution to African countries. Let me just give you one example. When you look at, for example, the risk profiling of disasters in Africa, what lesson that we learned, and it's a way before I took over at ARC, we used to profile the risk by having what we call a national risk profile, let's say of Malawi. And you find yourself within the same country. In some part of the country, too much rain. In other parts of the country, actually less rain. So you get basically a situation where in some cases you got flood, in some cases drought. So we then began to get into what we call cluster risk profiling. So we get risk profiling that actually reflect the reality of a particular part of the country as opposed to whole national risk profiling. In the case of Malawi, because we did that for the first time in Malawi, we were able to at least make a payout in Malawi because we actually take into account the specificity of Malawi. And that is why it's extremely critical when you look at disasters within the African countries, look at it from the perspective of the reality of the country as opposed to just one size fits all. However, there are some common problems where as a communities, Africans can actually benefit from. And that is the way you actually prepare yourself in terms of contingency planning, the way you pool your risks together so you don't go to the insurance market separately, but also the way you can learn from one another, because some countries are quite advanced in disaster risk management, some are a little bit not too advanced, but by forming a community, you can actually learn from one another. And that's what ARC is all about. How do you build a community of solidarity so Africans together can actually pool their resources and learn from one another so you can come up with much more sustainable disaster risk management when it comes to climate. And I think Nigeria is obviously one of our member states, has a lot to offer in terms of dealing with disasters, and we are doing the best that we can to make sure they can learn from other countries in Africa as well.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. DIONG, for your presentation. Very clear. My name is Ibrahima Cheikh. I am an EMBA student. I come from Senegal. And as you know, Senegal just came from discovering a huge amount of gas. What would you advise to the government for this gas? Should they use this gas to support the growth of the economy or invest in transitioning in renewable energy, for example? Thank you.
That happened in my home country, Senegal, where I'm from. And I think there are a couple of things to that question, and that is, number one, and I know this because in the previous life when I was in Senegal, I was the permanent secretary of energy, and I know that the lack of gas in supporting energy transition, but also productions of basically power is certainly something extremely critical in Senegal. I think there's just a couple of things, in my view, that Senegal could definitely learn a lot from what not to do in terms of basically having these natural resources. Whether it's Nigeria or Ghana and other countries, number one is just making sure there's a level of transparency in the resources actually generated by these natural resources so they can actually support our economy. And that's the reason why in Senegal, the whole notion about transparency but also local content is such that the country actually knows what those resources actually can generate in terms of additional revenues. And in the previous life in Senegal, I did actually lead a conversation, a dialogue nationally about what needs to be done in making sure that local content is actually felt throughout the exploitation of, for example, these resources. So hopefully they will continue to do that because that transparency is important to the general populace in recognizing that these resources belong to our country. It's very important to make sure that at least whatever is available in terms of revenues are utilized to actually support our economy. I think second, if you look at, for example, power generation, Senegal basically has a pool of energy sources, and that is renewable. It's our thermal energy actually sources, whereby some of these sources actually may require, for example, relate to gas. So the question is the government should also look at our power generation needs and make sure that these resources actually can support the way we actually generate power. And that is something certainly the government of Senegal will certainly do and make sure it actually benefit the country when it comes to power generation. But I think ultimately, in the case of gas, we also have to recognize this is something that we share with Mauritania. So it's a shared resource with neighboring countries. What I'm understanding is happening right now, the two countries are actually combining efforts and making sure that the resources actually support both economies in the way that as we basically work, with international communities, these resources actually will benefit our own development and our own economies. But there's a lot that we can learn from what not to do from other countries, both in terms of transparency, in terms of local content, and eventually also supporting power generation. And I hope Senegal will continue to do that.
Thank you. Additional questions also from our online audience? Then, because of the power of the microphone, I'll use that.
Because of the power of the microphone, I'll respond to you as well.
Thank you. No, clearly there is a huge challenge ahead of not only Baku but in general, to solve the climate conundrum. But at the same time, there might be opportunities ahead. Last week we were here in Joué-en-Josas. I always find it very difficult to pronounce. I do apologize. At our campus, we organized the Paris CLE Spring Event 2024, which is Paris CLE's spring entrepreneurial and entrepreneurship and technology power hub. So just on Thursday we were here, and then we were talking about clean tech. And clean tech. There were some figures revealed during our keynote panel in the morning. International Energy Agency saying that 25% of technologies have not reached maturity. I was suggesting another figure, depending on the estimates, between 30 to 40% of climate adaptation solutions are not there in the market. They are not in use. They are somehow missing. And we also were saying that it's not only important to scale up solutions, but to scale up and implement the right solutions, meaning those that do not have unintended consequences, rebound effects, socially, environmentally, or economically speaking. And with that in mind, we're also saying that 80% of the environmental impacts of a product can be avoided in the design phase through eco-design. So if the tools are there, and if we can think also in terms of an opportunity for business, what would be your message for business ahead of the challenge, but also the opportunity that the climate solutions can offer? Because we, in negotiations and in academic forums, we're always talking, we need to upscale solutions, we need to upscale solutions. And earlier in our conversation this morning, we were saying, well, about business models, about new finance models, and about experimenting a bit with, but that's extremely risky also for business.
Right.
So what are your thoughts related to not only the role of business, but what can business do to take the challenge and the opportunity of climate adaptation and climate mitigation solutions?
Right. Absolutely. But I think you brought up a very good point, and that is what I said earlier, and that is, we spend a lot of time on climate resilience. It's important because we need to protect the most vulnerable. And that's why I spend a lot of time on loss and damage, but also other instruments we have to develop. But at the same time, there is tremendous opportunity for entrepreneurship, but also for businesses. I often say that if there is no market, there is no business. And the mere fact that there is a market potential, that's a good starting point talking about actually business opportunities. And that is something I believe that the green economy actually offers to entrepreneurs, particularly in the developing world where I came from. But there are three challenges to seizing that opportunity. And I was mentioning to you, Dean, earlier, in a previous life at IFC, I used to be in charge of SME business in Africa. And the challenges are basically fourfold. Number one, as I said earlier, access to market. When there is a market, certainly entrepreneurs, that's all they need to seize the opportunity, to basically seize that market, and because there's a problem, and you have to come up with the solutions. I think second, and that is the access to capital. As a business, obviously, it is important to have the long-term capital that allows you basically to seize an opportunity. And I think in many countries in Africa, particularly those who are starting and have a business idea, unless you have access to equity or quasi-equity in some cases, it's very difficult to actually take your ideas into reality. And I think what we need to do, particularly with regard to additional resources, make sure resources are available to entrepreneurs who want to get into the green economy, and having access to capital that allows them to basically come up with long-term solutions. I think the second part is the capacity building of most of these businesses are such that in some cases you may have the business idea, you may have the capital, but to actually structure these businesses in a way that become actually viable, it's extremely challenging, at least from my experience in Africa. So there's something that may be actually done in making sure that entrepreneurs have the opportunity to seize green economy are supported in the way they can seize this opportunity and turn it into like a business opportunity and eventually create jobs. The reality is, somebody mentioned to me one day that governments are in the business of facilitating business, not in the business of doing business. So therefore, entrepreneurs are in the business of doing business because as entrepreneurs that create 80% of the jobs are created by the private sector. So any government who is serious about job creation should make sure that entrepreneurship will actually strive in a way that they can be part of the solutions. I think the last point, which is equally important, is the ecosystem of business in most of these countries. Do we have actually pro-business governments whereby the basic entrepreneurs that have opportunities in the green economy are supported in the way that the business environment is actually conducive to doing business? The tax system is such that it's not too cumbersome. There's not a government bureaucracy, but eventually making sure that the entrepreneurs that actually have ideas can actually strive. If I look at in the climate business, the whole thing's about risk modeling, the whole opportunity in making sure the tools are available to make decisions. These are opportunities with all this tech that are coming in innovation, they can seize and be able to be part of the solution. I think eventually, what I like, which is really good today, and I'm old enough to remember this, I'm not gonna reveal my age, but in about 30-something years ago, it was very difficult to put in one room public sector and private sector about the environment. There's a lot of blame game. The private sector will come in, they will be blamed for all the worst thing in the world. It was very difficult to have a conversation with the private sector. But today, if you go to the COP, there is a whole conversation happening with the private sector, with the NGOs and the government. So it's no longer about blaming each other, it's about trying to find solutions. And I do think the private sector has so much to offer and make sure we can all be part of the solution.
Thank you, Mr. DIONG. An additional question, because we are at HEC, the European Business School.
I didn't realize that.
And in our audience, we have our future leaders, people who will be, or who has been already, executive MBA, MBAs, in the different masters, Grand École. They are our future leaders, and they've been for a few weeks now in an award-winning certificate of climate and business, led by Professor Danny Abler and our colleague Igor Shislov. And one of the reasons why we are today is because it's not only important to have the climate days and the other days of our SNO Institute, but also to expose and to bring the opportunity, and the other way around, to bring the questions of our students, who we see them as the leaders of tomorrow, because it couldn't be otherwise. So do you have a message for business school education? You've talked a lot about capacity building and about skills development in general and about entrepreneurial spirit, not only for decision makers in policy, but also for business now. And what message you would say to business school education, and I should say students in particular, about the climate challenge and the climate opportunities, and what's our role in your view?
Absolutely. I was telling, first of all, I have to tell this story because HEC is very special to me. I was telling you, Dean, earlier, in the 70s, there you go again, my age. My actually uncle went to HEC, was the first university graduate in our family. And when we came back from HEC, I believe he was the first CEO of a national TV station in Senegal. And I look up to him and say, well, this is what happened when you go to university. And then that story stayed with me forever and actually inspired me to basically study around the world, in China, in the US as well, at Columbia, to become where I am today. So I think HEC really has an impact on me. And that's the reason why when I was offered the opportunity to my good sister here, Anna, to come and speak to you. I did not resist to come because this is a very special school to me because of the inspiration I got from my uncle. I think second, and I was telling the Dean, I love your motto, think, teach, and act. So my presence here is really part of your act, part of your motto, in connecting the academic world to the world that I belong to, our practitioners. And I think we just signed with the Dean a letter of intent to make sure we can actually join forces in making sure the ACT part of HEC is taken to the next level, and that is to make sure, the challenges that we face in dealing basically some of the problems about data management, we can actually rely on your creativity, your innovation, and make sure that academic is actually part of the solution. That's something we're committed to doing. I think second, as I said, we are sitting on the bundle of data, a reality in 39 African countries. And that information can certainly inspire not only thought leadership, knowledge management, all these things that we're dealing with on a daily basis. And we intend to actually leverage on your creativity, your expertise, and making sure that academia is actually part of the solutions. And one of the things that's really important to remind you, what we do is bigger than all of us. And the solution does not just lie on us, it relies on all of us. And one thing that's being recognized today when it comes to the global climate crisis, it calls for global solidarity. Academia, private sector, public sector, other institutions as well. And I believe when we come together, it's even more powerful than actually the billions that we're expecting to mobilize, because ultimately, there are many vulnerable communities across Africa. They expect so much from us, and we have no right to fail them. And that's why I'm super excited about our partnership. And I have no doubt when I come back and see you a couple of years from now, our conversation is not just about telling you what to do, but what we've done together, making sure that no one is left behind across Africa. That's why I'm extremely happy to be here. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you on Climate Day. And if you invite me again, I will come back anytime.
Thank you, Mr. Ibrahima. Mr. Ibrahima Cheikh DIONG, Assistant General of United Nations and Director General of the African Risk Capacity Group, our friend at HEC, and we look forward to continue our collaboration. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. DIONG.
I'm enjoying it. We should continue?
Yes, let's go. Thank you, Mr. DIONG.